If you know anything about World War II, it's probably something about how it was the war that tanks replaced horses, and that the Italians were only slightly more embarrassing allies than the French. Of course, a deeper dive will reveal more nuance to each of those. For instance, the German invasion of the Soviet Union was far more equestrian than it was mechanized, and a re-equipped French army was integral to Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France that happened at the same time as Normandy. But that still leaves the Italians, the butt of every World War II joke. From needing extra resources for their pasta rations in board games, to laughable statistics pulled up on Wikipedia battle summary pages, the Italians only seem to find solace in the occasional patronizing quote by a German officer that some units did okay. But far from the desert sands where they are normally imagined, an Italian expedition in Soviet Ukraine found itself alone on a winter line on Christmas Day, 1941. Russian armor was coming. And what's worse, they were cavalry, and they were not meant to hold off Russian tanks. All the World War II stereotypes were working against them, and it didn't look like there would be a Christmas truce either. This is the story of the Christmas battle. Much is often made about how the personal relationship between American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill held together and defined the Allies. Equally important, though, for their opponents, was how the personal relationship between German Führer Adolf Hitler and Italian Duce Benito Mussolini shaped the Axis. Both relationships were rocked at times by spasms of suspicion and jealousy, but also moments of goodwill and inspiration. Mussolini's attitude on the eve of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union was a mixture of all that. He knew that Hitler planned to invade Russia soon, despite Nazi leadership choosing not to tell their Italian allies. Not wishing to be left behind, the Italians independently assembled a force of 62,000 soldiers to be ready when the German invasion started. This was not a trivial offering. The Italians at that time were still fighting in East Africa, North Africa, and the Balkans. But fighting communism was one of the core tenets of Mussolini's fascist reign. To be absent was to lose face. In Mussolini's words, he proclaimed, "Should we be absent, even the fact that I was the first one to fight communism will not count in the face of the realization that the Italians were not present in Russia." The units set aside for Mussolini's grand gesture were some of the best equipped in the Italian army. 2 infantry divisions, the 9th Pasubio and the 52nd Torino, were semi-motorized, some of their trucks freshly commandeered for the army, many with business logos still painted on their sides. They were accompanied by the 3rd Cavalry Division, which consisted both of horsemen with sabers and riflemen on motorcycles and bikes. Despite this hodgepodge of vehicles, their quantity resulted in the Italians being more motorized than their larger Axis allies, including the Germans. These were accompanied by units of the Italian Royal Air Force, and various support units that provided medical and veterinary services. After much pleading with the Germans to be allowed to join their invasion, the Italians were finally added to the battle line as the Corpo di Spezioni Italiano in Russia, or Caesar. They took up positions in Romania and would join the invasion of Soviet Ukraine in July of 1941. From the beginning, the Germans were impressed by their Italian allies. Their high degree of mobility allowed the Italians to execute many of the complicated maneuvers that the Germans were more famous for. The first actions recall some of the big place names of the Russian Civil War. The Italians were put in charge of sealing the back end of a planned German pocket, surrounding the Soviet forces around the Dniester and Bug rivers by a quick drive to Nikolaev, a port that, just 32 years before, a French garrison fighting for the Soviets' rivals had surrendered in. The Italians drove down the west bank of the Bug River, spearheaded by their motorcycle infantry to seal off all Soviet crossings. Although some Soviet soldiers managed to escape before the circle was closed, a sizable amount did not, scoring Italy's first victory against the Communists at the cost of only 15 killed. By September, just 2 months into the invasion, The Italian expedition was 400 miles, or 644 kilometers, inside the Soviet Union. Mussolini flew out to the front to congratulate the troops of the Caesar and their leader, General Giovanni Messe. He lauded the troops, saying that they looked like Italian soldiers, joyed to see the man who had sent them there. Though the expedition had been a huge success so far for the Italians, it had not come without personal cost to many. Mussolini himself had lost his eldest son, a pilot, during the campaign, and his daughter was serving as a nurse at a field hospital. The Italians by this time had formed the spearhead of an entire group of German armies, and were reinforced by the Torino Division, who had marched over 800 miles, 1,287 kilometers, to join the more mobile divisions. They would be just in time for the Italians' finest hour. Refining their tactics from July and August, the Italians once again were in charge of closing a Russian pocket. This time it was against the Dnieper River. The Italians drove up and down the west bank of that river. They forced their way through Soviet minefields and broke through lines of Soviet tank divisions. The Caesar formed a double envelopment of a Russian division of over 100 kilometers, meeting up at the town of Petrikauka. The fighting to close the gap cost the Italians just under 300 casualties, but they captured over 10,000 Soviet soldiers. Huge amounts of Soviet equipment and equally important horses were captured, and the flank was cleared for the Germans to advance to Rostov, a principal Russian city on the Sea of Azov. No one was laughing at the Italians that day. The next few months continued to go well for the Italians. Elements of the Caesar participated in the occupation of the port of Odessa, and capture of the major industrial city of Donetsk, then called Stalino, after intense resistance from Soviet defenders. The Italian cavalry played a critical part in these operations, as the few good roads in the area limited the movement by motorized units, often being deployed in rough terrain along the flanks of the main advance. By the end of October, most of the principal cities of southern Ukraine were in the hands of the Axis. And then, the snow began to fall. Like the Germans, Italian commanders had failed to adequately equip their troops with winter gear. General Messe had prudently bought a large number of fleece hats in Romania in order to distribute to his troops, but the rest of the Italian uniform, fine enough for temperate climates, proved wanting. Their shorts, or breeches, only went just below the knee, the rest of the leg being covered only in socks, which would quickly soak through in the snow. Supplies ran low, and Italians leaned on their Romanian allies to make up for shortage of food and fuel. Horses began to die to exposure, thinning out the ranks of cavalry and hurting logistical units. Still, perhaps from the benefit of a Mediterranean villa, the Italian foreign minister claimed that the Italian soldiers proved hardier than the German in resisting the terrible cold of the Russian winter. Perhaps there was some truth to that, as after a fierce Soviet counterattack, the Germans were driven back from Rostov in early December. Axis troops dug in, with the Italians taking a forward position along the Moise River west of Rostov. Units were exhausted from a half year's fighting. They were cold and hungry, with barely enough horses for some to be called cavalry. Perhaps, if they were lucky, 1941 would turn out to be like 1914, and some relief could be had around Christmas with a miraculous truce. It was not to be. On Christmas Day, 1941, the Soviets attacked. 6 Soviet divisions with armor support attacked the depleted remnants of 4 Italian units, half of which were cavalry. It was a callback to the early propaganda reels of German tanks smashing Polish horsemen. The Soviet tanks buckled the Axis line, piercing it in so many places that small groups of Italians were forced to band together to form isolated pockets of resistance. Men huddled together in frozen trenches as Soviet soldiers roared past, striving to make their own encirclement of the Axis invaders. Soviet units captured the only road serviceable to motorized units in the area, and the way to Donetsk was open. It looked like it would be another Rostov. Still, the Italian cavalry would not give in. Though their horses and vehicles were frozen, they would not surrender. From Christmas to New Year's Eve, they held firm. On December 31st, when they were on the verge of collapsing, they were finally relieved by elements of the German 1st Panzer Army and their own infantry. By staying firm in their positions, they once again formed the back of an encirclement, and all those Soviet troops that had charged past the positions were trapped. All in all, over 40,000 Soviet soldiers were captured, and the Italians suffered 168 killed and 715 wounded. Tellingly, almost half those wounded were as the result of frostbite. The Soviets did not attempt another attack in that sector for the rest of the winter, giving the Axis troops a well-earned rest. Had it not been for the Italians, their German, Romanian, and Hungarian allies standing fast, it is likely that they would have been thrown back from much of their summer gains. War is never simple. Memes and tier lists of who was the best army of World War II will never be able to go into the detail required to highlight individual areas of valor amidst the more generally sensational defeat. It would be a disservice to those men who fought bravely and well for their countries to lump them in with those who did not have the capacity, equipment, skill, or, yes, courage to go on like they did. Hopefully this episode shows that any nation, properly equipped and well led, can perform bravely and skillfully, and should not always be defined by its defeats. Thank you all for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it. I know this channel tends to try to go beyond the typical battle-centric history, but there were enough elements in this story that went against the typical World War II narrative that it seemed to be interesting to show here. And besides, if Die Hard can be considered a Christmas movie, so can this. I'd like to thank all my subscribers, both old and the many of you who joined recently. Hearing your comments is what makes researching these exciting. I hope you all have some happy holidays, and I'll see you all next year.